Okay, we're back talking about biblical genre, and today we're going to talk about the genre of New Testament letters. Now, again, genre is simply a recognition that within the pages of Scripture, you have a variety of types of literature. Now, we were just talking about Gospels, and these Gospels are these wonderful the inauguration of the New Covenant order. And then we have, including Acts, I'll include Acts to that, and then we have a bunch of letters. And you might think of the Gospels as kind of like the Torah of the New Testament, and then the letters as the prophets of the New Testament, saying, okay, here's how we live this out. You know, one thing I get really tired of hearing is, well, Jesus was like this, he was cool and laid back, and then Paul came along and created this Christian religion. Ugh. That is such a misunderstanding of the New Testament. It is such a misunderstanding of history. It is such a misunderstanding of the Christian faith. Yeah, in the Gospels, we have it all laid out for us. Paul does not create anything new. Peter does not create anything new. James, Jude, they don't create anything new in their letters. They're just telling us, okay, here's how we live this out. Okay, let's talk about these letters for a minute. There are a variety of letters. Paul has 12. 12 of these letters, and by the way, they're in order of length, not their order of composition. Probably Galatians and 1 Thessalonians were the first they wrote, and probably almost certainly 2 Timothy was the last. We also have a letter from James, 2 letters of Peter, 3 letters from John. Now, how do we understand these letters? How do we understand and apply them? Always, if you just keep in mind that it functions like the prophets, it's not creating something new. It's taking, okay, here is the Jesus faith. Jesus, Son of God, Son of Man, fully God, fully man, comes, lives amongst us, dies on the cross for us, then is resurrected from the dead, and he sends his apostles out to proclaim salvation in his name. Understanding that, again, not creative, but simply prophetic application of the message of Jesus in the Gospels. Now, you take each of these letters, you always ask the question of who is the author, who's it going to, about when was it written, what's the theme, and how do I outline this book? You do that with the letters, and actually do a lot of that with almost every book of the Bible, but that's always a good way to start. Author, date, theme, outline. Author, date, theme, outline. Especially theme. Because these letters have themes. Romans, the theme is the inside story of how the gospel works. 1 Corinthians is answering questions in a kind of a troubled church. Ephesians and 1 Peter both read as, okay, here's a shot at a comprehensive manual for the Christian, understand our faith and how to live it out. So understanding these themes of Philippians, this theme of the giving of oneself as Christ does, and that's the call of the believer too. And getting the theme of the book often is a really important part of the process. Understanding who the recipients are. Now, the recipients of 1 Corinthians are very different than the recipients of James, for example. You get very different books because not only the different authors, but they're written to different people. So that's a big difference right there. Another thing to do is when you read a New Testament letter, you have to ask, how does this fit in with the total body of writings by this particular author? Now, in the case of James, that's the only thing we have. With Peter, we've got 2, and they're very different, and we can understand there's interesting, complex issues there. With Paul, you got 12 letters. And it's interesting to see how, and sometimes chronologically, early letters, he says things that are clearly more fully developed in a later letter. It's very cool to see when Paul does that kind of thing. So you often look at the body of work by that particular writer. In the case of John, you got 3 letters, but you also got the Gospel of John and Revelation. So there's a lot of John-related literature. How does this fit with the other things written by this author? So I told you when we were talking about prophets to think in terms of oracles. I told you when we're talking about the Gospels to think in these sections that we call pericopes, these stories, and to think in terms of those. In the case of New Testament letters, well, these are real letters and they are in paragraphs. Are the paragraphs there in the original Greek? No, because they didn't use paragraphs, which is kind of annoying. As a matter of fact, they didn't even use space between words, which is super annoying. But fortunately, generally, when you use a New Testament Greek, somebody's gone through and made the space between. But talk the old copies, they didn't even have space between the letters, which can be irritating at times. But so when it comes to letters, think in paragraphs. And most printed Bibles have already figured out the paragraphs for you. And most of the time, like 99% of the time, they're right. But every now and then remind yourself, this may not be really where the cut is. So you'll find that occasion. But think in paragraphs. The general rule of application of New Testament today is that what was meant for them is meant for us. There's not enough difference. However, there are times the New Testament authors and the recipients are facing issues that are entirely unlike what we face. In that case, the application may not be so direct. That might give us some insight into things like Paul says, well, I think every woman should keep her head covered. Okay, what was, well, that may be a cultural thing that, doesn't really connect with us. Meat sacrificed to idols. Directly, we don't really encounter that problem very much, although in some parts of the developing world, that's still an issue. So you got to understand, look at the specific situation and figure out what the universal application is. But you'll find that the gap between us and them is usually not that much because we are under the same covenant. Unlike when we looked at the Old Testament, different covenant. So we have to read everything in the Old Testament law, especially through the glasses of the New Testament, the coming of Christ. So it gets, when it comes to the New Covenant, it's much more direct. It's much more, this is for us. This is our covenant. The Old Testament is not our covenant. Now, the Old Testament is important, but it's not our covenant. This is our covenant. So the things that are most directly applicable to our lives are found in the Gospels and in the letters. Okay? Well, we'll pick this up next time, and we're going to talk about the last genre, the apocalyptic, next time. Until then, bye-bye.